All right, welcome to your Newsmax Daily for Tuesday, September 2nd, 2025, and welcome back to business on the 245th day of the year, the first of 5 Tuesdays this month, and World Coconut Day. You may have used some coconuts for pina coladas by the pool over the Labor Day holiday weekend, which also produced plenty of news. And once again, there was no winning ticket sold in last night's Powerball. It's incredible. Now the jackpot goes up to $1.3 billion. $1.3 billion tomorrow night, up for grabs. After a relatively quiet weekend at the White House, President Trump is scheduled to make a big announcement from the Oval Office this afternoon. So far, the White House hasn't provided any details on what it is going to be or related to. It could be related to any one of the weekend headlines discussed on the Labor Day edition of the Newsmax Daily. The appeals court ruling on tariffs, which the president addressed on Truth Social over the weekend, or maybe the weekend summit in China with President Xi hosting Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Prime Minister Modi, where they seem to unite against Trump's tariffs and, for the most part, against the ways of the Western world. Or he may be addressing all the reports of his alleged health issues that came out over the weekend on a lot of the talk shows, mainstream media talk shows. He also posted on Truth Social, as I mentioned yesterday, that he never felt better in his life, all in caps. Or the announcement could be about sending National Guard troops into Chicago finally, where over the weekend, at least 50 people were shot and several killed.
We're going to defend our democracy in the city of Chicago. We're going to protect the humanity of every single person in the city of Chicago.
That's Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson at a rally yesterday. Regardless of what bill of goods the Democratic leaders of that city and the state are trying to sell you, the facts speak for themselves. More from Carl Higbie.
Okay, so 53 shot, 7 killed just this weekend in Chicago to date. Don't worry, I'm sure something else will happen tonight too, but that's almost double. You had the exact same weekend last year, so don't tell me the situation's getting better in the same place that says they don't need help. Yeah, okay, sure seems like you do.
We do not want to see tanks in our streets. We do not want to see families ripped apart. We do not want grandmothers thrown into the back of unmarked vans. We don't want to see homeless Chicagoans harassed or disappeared by federal agents. We don't want to see Chicagoans arrested for sitting on their porch. That's not who we are as a city, and that's not who we are as a nation.
Well, look, the reason you got here is because law enforcement is not who you are as a city. Not a knock on the cops. You just don't let them do their job. You don't enforce anything, and you let the courts let the criminals back out onto the street. By the way, tanks in the street, dude, it's not Fallujah. Chicago is more deadly than Fallujah when I was there, but they are not going to roll tanks down the street, mostly because it would tear up the street. They're not ripping families apart. Unless they committed crimes, then no matter who you are, what color your skin is, if you don't get to take your kids to jail with you. That's the separation that happens. That's what they're talking about. They're not disappearing homeless people, not like Gavin Newsom did when he cleaned up the streets of San Francisco for the president of China when he visited. He straight up loaded homeless people onto buses and shipped them to Timbuktu. Who knows where they went? People are not just randomly being harassed on their porch either, unless law enforcement has a warrant, which is in fact happening a lot. Many of those warrants have been around for years now, but you guys just don't enforce them. But also because all you have to do is enforce the laws, and this crime will largely stop, which you haven't done. But instead, for the last few years, you've just justified lawlessness. Even today, you've got Randy Weingarten jumping up and down, talking about federal troops when she should actually be worried about the fact that only 31% of 8th graders are proficient in reading, and only 26% are proficient in math in Chicago. Maybe she should have a rally about that. And Brandon Johnson even saying this.
No federal troops in the city of Chicago. No militarized force in the city of Chicago. We're going to defend our democracy in the city of Chicago.
In fact, you've called to defund the police and blame the problem on, like, mythical things.
You're calling to defund the police. Explain that.
Yeah, what we're seeing is obviously an outbreak of incredible frustration and anguish that communities that have been isolated through poverty over generations. And what we have is sort of a typical, very standard, quite frankly, a very tired response to the regularly scheduled pandemic, which is structural racism.
And that right there is why you have such a... There is no structural racism, especially not in Chicago. It's so much not a problem in Chicago that Jussie Smollett had to fake a hate crime for himself. But you do have a crime problem. But you want to talk about structural racism, you are a black mayor of a city with 35% of your appointed staff are black, only 30% appointees are white, with 35% of the municipal workforce black, in a city with a police force comprised of 20% black officers, 7 points higher than the 13% black population of the nation, with a city council that is 40% black, with 42% of the congressmen in your city limits being black, in a city that raised a black senator that went on to become the first black president, well, half black. Tell me more about systemic racism, please, Brendan. Or do you want to have a real conversation that you have essentially ignored majority black communities and allowed this problem to get way out of hand, like you have?
And that is former Navy SEAL Carl Higbie, host of Frontline. While the weekend shootouts were happening there in the Windy City, Mayor Johnson signed an executive order called the Protecting Chicago Initiative to basically counter the Trump administration's immigration and crime crackdown. Todd Starnes, host of the Todd Starnes Show, talked about other cities statistically having even higher crime rates than Chicago and the Trump administration's crime plan.
So why is the Trump administration putting all of its resources and efforts into bringing law and order to Chicago and D.C. and not places like Memphis or Detroit? That is the question raised by the New York Times today. They published a story titled "Crime Festers in Republican States While Their Troops Patrol Washington." Now, the Times specifically called out Tennessee Governor Bill Lee, wondering why the Republican governor dispatched National Guard troops to Washington instead of Memphis. The Times pointed out the murder rate in Memphis is about twice as high as D.C.'s. So why is Governor Lee turning a blind eye to the hurting citizens of his own state? Now, his office did not respond to questions, and it's no surprise Governor Lee, something of a thin-skinned rhino squish, not exactly cut from the gubernatorial cloth of, say, Ron DeSantis or even Greg Abbott. Now, Jeffrey Butts of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice told the Times that federal resources are not actually being targeted where they would make the most difference. And he said that the Trump administration's actions are not doing anything to improve public safety. Instead, he said it's designed to humiliate political opponents. Yeah, I'm not buying this one at all, folks. And we got to push back on this assertion. Look, TV stations in D.C. are actually commending the president's crime crackdown. So are local residents. They say it's safe for the kids to finally play outdoors, not to mention the fact the district's murder rate has cratered.
I feel safer. I do. It doesn't bother me at all. I just feel more military police presence there are. I just feel like I'm more inclined to be downtown more often.
We need order in our city. If you don't have no order, you ain't got no city.
I think it's a good thing because, you know what I'm saying, it's better for the community and safer for the kids, stop the violence.
I enjoy having extra security. I think it's a good thing. I mean, you want to feel safe when you're out and about, especially females.
And while Chicago Mayor Johnson is all but threatening to wage an armed rebellion against federal agents, residents of the Windy City, they're begging President Trump for help.
The National Guard has to come here, even if it's for a scare tactic. They have to come here. There's no control. There's no law and order.
Today, you hardly see a police car in a neighborhood. It just seems like crime is really out of control right now.
The whole neighborhood is just sick of people coming into the neighborhood and acting like they can just come ravage your stores, take what they want to take, and then they try to make you feel like you're wrong for defending your property.
We still have a problem. We have a problem with illegal guns. We have a high murder rate. We need help with that.
I think that the governor as well as the mayor should be on board with it just so we can get a bit more of security in Chicago the way that we need.
Now, several weeks ago, the president personally told me on my national radio show that he would be taking a look at Memphis, the city of my birth, my hometown, one of the most unique cities in the nation, turned into a war zone thanks to activist judges, a soft-on-crime district attorney, and Democrat lawmakers who say there's really not so much a crime problem as there is a perception problem. The fact is that Memphians, we don't hate Memphis. We hate what our city has become. And I suspect the good people in Detroit and D.C. and Chicago feel the same way about their towns. You see, the one common denominator here is that Democrats control the most violent cities in our nation, every last one of them. The Democrats have ruled our major cities for generations. They are responsible for the crime. They are responsible for the bloodshed. They are responsible for the moral decay and the cultural rot.
Todd Starnes is the host of the Todd Starnes Show on N2. That is Newsmax 2. So again, more than 50 people were shot, at least 7 dead over the Labor Day weekend in the Windy City, where the mayor signed an executive order that said it was to protect the city from, quote, this out-of-control administration. And Todd got me curious. According to the numbers this morning, the Memphis Police Department says 6 people were shot, 2 of them killed, several stabbings reported in Memphis as well over the weekend. The population of Memphis is about a quarter of Chicago's population. So if you times those numbers by 4, that would be 24 shootings, less than half of the 54 reported in Chicago. On yesterday's Newsmax Daily, and again, if you missed it, give it a listen, but I talked a lot about that big weekend summit in China between Chinese President Xi Jinping, Russian President Vladimir Putin, North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un, and India's Prime Minister Modi, who seemed to just be gushing over Vladimir Putin. By the way, this week, China is celebrating the anniversary of their defeat over Japan and the end of World War II. Again, China and North Korea have aided Russia in the war against Ukraine. And India is still buying oil from Russia, which is one of the reasons President Trump jacked up the tariffs even more, if not the main reason that he jacked up the tariffs. And I asked, what are they talking about, right? Were they talking about ending the Russian invasion in Ukraine or further supporting it? Was Modi making a deal to buy more oil from Russia? Bob Brooks, co-host of American Agenda, asked some of those same questions to some of the experts.
More on that in the Ukraine war. Let's bring in former National Security Council, Chief of Staff for the Trump administration, and former CIA analyst and senior fellow at the America First Policy Institute, Fred Fleitz, along with Trump's Deputy National Security Advisor for the Middle East and Vice President of the National Security at the Heritage Foundation, Victoria Coates. It's a pleasure to see you both. Fred, we'll start with you. Your take and your comments there on that report, specifically China and India's role with the war in Ukraine in aiding Russia, with oil purchases here. Talk about that.
I'm not going to read too much to see the heads of India and China holding hands at a summit in China. India and China are still enemies. They have enormous territorial differences. They have differences over Pakistan. I think this is an effort by Prime Minister Modi to get leverage against President Trump. He's upset about the sanctions. He's upset about U.S.-Pakistan policy. And obviously, Putin's going to try to exploit this, too. But look, Trump is the top dog, and I think all these lesser dogs are getting together and plotting to try to find a way to offset his influence. I don't think it's going to work.
Victoria, there was that very high-profile meeting between President Zelensky and President Donald Trump. President Trump has made it clear that he is still trying to get a sit-down interview between those 3 major leaders, Russia, Ukraine, and, of course, himself, the President of the United States. Do you foresee this potentially still taking place? Is it still a possibility that there could be this trilateral meeting?
Oh, I do. I think this is the diplomatic equivalent of what you might have called a long, hard slog, that this is going to be a really torturous process, but it doesn't mean that progress isn't being made. And I agree with Fred. The visit by Modi to China was an attention-getting device. He wants President Trump to pay attention to him. He really enjoyed his meeting his meeting in the Oval Office in January. If you look at what came out of that, it is a roadmap for the U.S.-India relationship. I remain very bullish on that long term. I think it's going to be one of our most important going forward. But the president needs to level set us on trade and tariffs. He needs to get the message to President Putin that this war has to end and use what leverage he has with the Indians to get them off the Russian gas. We did it in the first term with the Iranian gas. We can do it again.
Fred, let's talk about the end, potentially, the hypothetical end of the war and what that could look like. So the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she says that President Trump has actually already made it clear to her and others there will be an American presence in a post-war Ukraine. Will Russia ever come to terms with that or be okay with that?
I don't know who said that. I don't think it's true. I don't think there's any chance there'll be American troops going to Ukraine. European countries shouldn't be saying things like that. I think if there is some kind of security force to make sure that Russia doesn't invade again, it will mean Ukraine being armed to the teeth and some type of neutral peacekeeping forces deployed along the border. There's a number of nations that have experience in this. India is one of them. And that only works if both nations want peace. But in terms of European ground troops or American ground troops, I don't see that happening.
Former National Security Council Chief of Staff to the Trump administration, Fred Fleitz, and Deputy National Security Advisor for the Middle East, Victoria Coates, on Newsmax. So far, the White House hasn't really said that much about the meeting, but the relationship between China, Russia, and North Korea is obviously getting tighter, right? And it's obviously something to be concerned about. Last week's church shooting in Minneapolis also dominated the weekend news shows. Greg Kelly has coverage of the shooting that killed 2 children and wounded 18 others inside a church, as if you needed to be reminded.
I think there's one good thing that could come out of last week's violence. This should neutralize this debate about transgender. There is no debate. It is wrong. It is harmful. Take it from the mass murderer himself. I'm sorry. But it's cut and dry to you and me. The fake news is deathly afraid because they had a role in legitimizing this stuff. Yesterday on the Big Sunday News Show, that woman talks about the case in Minnesota for like 10 minutes with a congressman, and they don't mention anything about trans. Same thing goes on the CBS show, all of the shows. They just glossed over it. Some didn't even do the story at all. Isn't that something? Isn't that weird? And especially Fox News, you know, Fox. They'll always break your heart. Shannon Bream, right, on the Fox News Sunday show, they do about 10 seconds on the case. I think it's more significant. Let's see what they did.
10-year-old Harper Moisky and 8-year-old Fletcher Merkel are being remembered today as worshipers hold their first Sunday Mass at Annunciation Parish in Minneapolis since Wednesday's mass shooting. 15 other children were injured as well as 3 adults.
That's it. I think this is, imagine if it was a white supremacist, a so-called white supremacist, right? Oh my goodness gracious, we'd be having fire drills right now. I don't get it. I don't. But I think this could be a moment, right, where they turn off all this stuff. At least it should, because this stuff is sick, and it was all over the place. They pretended it was glorious. I never knew this made it to the cover of National Geographic. Did you?
Biologically a male, Zoe never felt like one.
I like the color pink. I scream like a girl. I act like a girl. I breathe like a girl. I'm not a boy. Like, I would just be very defensive about it.
Along with Venice and Maddie, Zoe was one of 3 transgender young people we profiled in that story. Since then, the subject of transgender kids has moved into the mainstream.
It was glorified. And you could see why already impressionable kids, who are impressionable by definition, would fall for some of this stuff, and maybe even their parents. It was a shortcut You know, usually to gain recognition, you got to do something, right? You got to work hard. You got to sweat, grit. This thing, you just identified as somebody else, and in come the accolades, or so it seemed. This was a multi-pronged effort, really. They got some of the biggest people in America to embrace this stuff.
Greg Kelly is the host of Greg Kelly Reports, 9 p.m. Eastern. Check it out tonight. And Uber is getting some heat today after an Uber driver, you may have seen this over the weekend, now identified as an illegal alien, attacked the CEO of a company that he was giving a ride to. Newsmax crime reporter Jason Matera has the story.
South Carolina biotech CEO Brian Coble says he was left seriously injured after a brutal attack by an Uber driver who never should have been in this country, let alone behind the wheel.
I don't know a lot about immigration, but I wouldn't imagine someone who snuck over the border illegally has a social security number to give to Uber.
The driver, a Russian national who slipped into the U.S. illegally in 2022, somehow cleared Uber's background checks and was still picking up fares minutes after leaving his victim bleeding and unconscious in a parking lot.
Frankly, my next memory basically goes from cancel the ride to I'm in a hospital bed.
A concussion, 7 staples, 4 stitches, and lingering brain trauma. That's what Brian Coble says he got for daring to cancel a ride when this illegal alien driver refused to let his service dog in. And the kicker? Uber allegedly turned around and blamed him.
Uber deactivated the account. While this person actually went and picked up an Uber ride 2 minutes later after leaving me bleeding out in a parking lot.
Now Coble is suing Uber, accusing the company of negligence and calling its vetting system a complete failure. But his case may be just one piece of a much bigger problem. A tech watchdog group says there's a booming black market for Uber accounts right on Facebook. It's called account sharing. Verified driver profiles bought and sold, letting unvetted, even undocumented individuals pick up riders under someone else's name.
For a $200 billion company, you would think this would have been a discussion they want to have. And they clearly would much rather just avoid the issue, create a runaround scenario, obfuscate, and just continue to put people at risk every single day.
Mark Allison, we wanted to get Uber's side of the story, not only about the lawsuit, but about the claim that these driver profiles are being bought and sold on social media. So we reached out to the company. A spokesman said that they won't comment on the litigation, but they did say that Uber is deeply committed to safety and complies with all federal, state, and local laws and regulations around worker eligibility. And that may be true, but it does appear that there is a thriving black market where you have drivers who have gone through Uber's vetting process, then go ahead and sell their account, their profiles to unvetted drivers. In fact, this one tech watchdog group counted at least 80 Facebook groups with more than 800,000 users. And it's designed to go ahead and buy and sell these account profiles for rideshare, delivery share, apps, and that is a big problem, especially if these drivers shouldn't be in the country at all or who wouldn't have passed a background check otherwise.
Newsmax crime reporter Jason Matera on Wake Up America this morning. We all know if there's a demand for any service or product, if the demand is there, people are going to try and figure out some way to profit from it, right? But if you sell your ride share profile or even your food delivery app profile to an illegal alien who could be dangerous and may not even have a license, you should go to jail for a long time. This is something the White House should look at. Facebook pages of people selling their profiles to illegal aliens. Number one, that's insane. Number two, it shouldn't be that hard to track those people down if they're all over Facebook. And why isn't Facebook doing something about this, right? They're supposedly monitoring everything, so they don't see this? Remember the story last week after the deadly semi-crash in Florida. There was another one somewhere else, but then we found out that the DMV employees were selling CDL licenses and driver licenses to illegal aliens. There needs to be serious consequences for something like that. To what level of lowness can society go? That's my takeaway from this whole thing. How low can we go? Speaking of lowlifes, the lowest of the lowlife, there's new movement in the case of the Epstein files. Today, members of the Congressional Committee, both Republicans and Democrats, meeting with some of Epstein's victims who are pushing for the release of the Epstein files. Former FBI Director Robert Mueller, you know, the guy that led the investigation into the Trump-Russia collusion, he was scheduled to testify to the committee today into the Jeffrey Epstein case, but over the weekend announced that he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 4 years ago. Robert Mueller, former FBI director, Parkinson's. In a statement to the New York Times, his family said he was diagnosed 4 years ago. And I say this with all due respect to Robert Mueller and anyone else suffering from this terrible disease. But he was diagnosed 4 years ago, according to his family, according to the report in the New York Times. And days before he is set to testify, his family announces this to the world and says because of his Parkinson's, he will not be able to comply with the White House Oversight Committee's planned subpoena for him to testify today. And again, this was in Sunday's New York Times. And New York Democratic Rep Jerry Nadler announced that he will not seek re-election. The 78-year-old says he was inspired by President Biden, who talked about the need for generational change in the party. Thank goodness. Nadler has served for 5 decades. And I'm not saying that because he's a Democrat. That's not a Democrat or Republican thing. Nobody needs to serve for 5 decades. I talked about Rudy Giuliani's car crash yesterday, but President Trump says he's going to give Rudy Giuliani the Presidential Medal of Honor, calling Giuliani the toughest fighter that he knows. On Wall Street, stocks started the new week and the new month deep in the red this morning. The Dow down 400, the NASDAQ down 300. Yeah, welcome back. The highlight of the week will be Friday's monthly jobs report for the month of August, with the Fed interest rate cut looming this month and President Trump firing the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics last month. These numbers, let's say, will be highly scrutinized. Bitcoin is up a little bit this morning, but over the weekend it moved south of $110,000. It's at $109,000 and change this morning. Be sure to keep up with all of today's news. Again, the president has a big announcement from the White House this afternoon and the Epstein Files case investigation on Capitol Hill. Keep up with all of it on Newsmax, N2, and at Newsmax.com. Also, make sure you're streaming Newsmax Plus so you get all of your favorite shows with all your favorite hosts and all of the expert analysis. I'm Tony Marino. Thank you, as always, for checking out the Newsmax Daily Podcast. Continue sharing it with other folks. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday that feels like a Monday. National Coconut Day. Don't forget, pay attention and keep on fighting the good fight.
News breaks every minute, every day. You need the app, the Newsmax app. Find it free on your smartphone store. Then watch us anytime, anywhere.
Information. Truth. Is freedom. Is Newsmax. It's real news for real people.